Good morning, everyone. Actually, for me, I have a long history with this fellowship. When I first came to the University of Arkansas, I came here as an opera assistant. Under some of you, if you are old enough, may know Richard Brothers, who was Richard and Alma was an important member of this church, and he coerced me into playing piano for this fellowship. And I have really many beautiful memories of that time and the people that I've met here. So it's sort of a treat for me to be back among you. So today, we're talking a little bit about censorship and the role of censorship in the world of classical music. And this all came about a bit over the spring. Brenda and I went to a performance of Fidelio, which was broadcast through the Metropolitan High Definition broadcast that they broadcast here in local theaters and around the world. This is Beethoven's only opera. And before the performance started, this is quite unusual, there was a rather striking introduction by the Met director, Peter Gelb, who, and I'm quoting this, in the early 1800s when Fidelio was composed, Beethoven believed in the power of the republic, the right of people to govern, end quote. He further characterized, quote, Fidelio as Beethoven's opera against tyranny and about individual resistance and heroism in the face of oppression. Great art, like Fidelio, he continued, is a pillar of a free and just society. And he concluded with this remark, so today's performance of Fidelio and other acts of artistic resistance symbolize the democratic world's fight for its inalienable rights of justice, freedom, and democracy. It also has some of the most heroically beautiful music ever composed. And here's a short example of that. This is the chorus in the end of the first act of the opera. There have been prisoners who have been, abducted and imprisoned. And part of the plot unfolding is these prisoners are allowed to come out of their cells and take in fresh air. And this is what they're singing. Witnessing, or after this opera, watching the experience sort of stimulated some conversation between Brenda and myself about Beethoven's time, our own time. And at one point, it took a turn towards the difficulty that Beethoven had with censors, and that eventually led to Brenda's invitation for me to talk about censorship and music. So I'm going to try to cram a lot of stuff into a little bit of time. So I'm going to generally follow a timeline. I must say, just for this Au Lust, how wonderful to breathe the air. I remember I first heard this probably when I was in high school. It was a centennial of Beethoven's birth, and they were offering LP, vinyl records, and it's the first time I heard Fidelio. This piece still sort of brings tears to my eyes when I hear it. Both the sentiment of it and the beauty of the music. And there's no champion, I don't think, in the world of music for freedom more than Beethoven. Consistently, it was like. So in 1776, that's the date we all know, Beethoven was 6 years old. Mozart was 20. Born and growing up in Bonn, Germany, and Beethoven was more than just a music phenomenon. Bonn was one of the leading centers of Enlightenment thought and practice. Bonn was a university town with a lively coffee shop culture where Beethoven would have discussed Schiller, Rousseau, Voltaire, Goethe. His teacher and his mentor, Christian Gottlob Neff, was a leading figure in the Illuminati movement of the Masons. The ideals of the incubating French Revolution, liberty, equality, brotherhood, were embraced by Beethoven and stayed with him until the end of his life. And we all know that musically that culminated in his Ninth Symphony, that amazing hymn to brotherhood and freedom. In 1776, Vienna was under the firm control of Maria Theresa and was markedly more conservative in thinking and practice than Bonn. But when she died in 1780, she was succeeded by Joseph II, who ushered in a period of more liberal governing. 6 years into Joseph II's rule, Mozart composed The Marriage of Figaro. Some of the more revolutionary material had already been excised from Beaumarchais' play. However, the upending of social order in both the play and the opera propelled the action. In the end of this opera, I don't know if you've ever experienced it. It's an amazing. It's a really fun and very modern work of art. But by the end of this opera, there's an inversion of the accepted social order. The servants have indeed gotten the better of their masters. And this is true both in plot and, interestingly, in their nobility of character. The literary theme of the drama is reinforced by Mozart's inversion of class dance rhythms. I found this really fascinating about the opera. So the servants' arias are accompanied by the courtly rhythms of the minuet, and the count's lavish actions are accompanied by the rhythms of peasant dances. So this would have been very apparent to people in his time. So admittedly, this was a little window when these revolutionary ideas were able to sneak by the censors and be presented to the public. The only censors that involved it is there was an important soliloquy that Figaro in the play delivered that was an invective against the aristocracy, and that was considered too incendiary, and that was deleted by the censors. However, the rest of the play was able to stand. And it was not only the elimination of that, but this happens in some senses. There was Mozart's librettist for the opera, Da Ponte, also was a very good political manipulator. So his machinations also helped get a lot of things by the censors. The opera was wildly successful in Vienna, and especially in Prague, and continues today to be one of the mainstays of the operatic repertoire. A year later, in 1787, Beethoven left Bonn, made his first move to Vienna to study with Mozart, but had to return to take over the family after his mother's illness and death. And his father, unfortunately, could not even manage to take care of the family due to, he was a serious alcoholic. And Beethoven had to step in. But it also put him back into this really lively, vibrant culture in Bonn, which formed so much of his thinking and shaped his ideas throughout his life. Of course, in 1789, the French Revolution came. 2 years later, the year that Mozart died, he composed the Magic Flute. And this is an opera that managed to escape censorship because even though it was an overtly Masonic work, because Joseph II himself was a Mason, so there were no trouble with censorship in that. Just sort of a lucky, fortunate convergence of time. The following year, in 1792, the next year, after Beethoven came back to Vienna to study with Mozart, but unfortunately Mozart had just died. So he stayed in Vienna for the rest of his life. And of course, a year later, the French royals were beheaded. And in the world of censorship and art, this changed everything. The latest Habsburg Emperor Francis II suddenly established the Vienna secret police. And the relatively liberal policies of the Enlightenment were suddenly dangerous to espouse. To have a sense of this network that he discovered, Vienna was the clearinghouse for most of the mail that went through Europe. They had a very efficient system. And they managed to open every letter that came through there, reread it, and reseal it. And this network of spies just continued to grow. And it did affect Beethoven's life directly. So at the time of the Congress of Vienna, then there would have been, for every 5 citizens in Vienna, one working for the government. So in this gathering, so look around, and you might see, who is it? Who's going to leave here and tell, what was discussed, what you said, overheard a private conversation? So this was the atmosphere then in which Beethoven spent those years in Vienna. It got progressively worse. And then in 1798, the French playwright Bouilly wrote a play called Leonore, or Conjugal Love was its subtitle. It was reputedly based on a true story of a heroic French woman who rescued her husband from a political prison. The play was quickly adapted into operas written in the trendy post-revolutionary rescue genre. In 1799, Napoleon shows up on the scene. Early on, Beethoven was an ardent supporter of Napoleon. In 1804, Beethoven decided to use Bouilly's French play as the basis for his opera Fidelio. There were already other operatic adaptations of this play in circulation, and already to please the censors, the setting had been changed from France to the Spain during the Inquisition. So this was a common practice of the rebranding of music in that time to make it acceptable. And the original political prisoner had been recast as the victim of merely a personal vendetta. So the censors managed to scrub the opera, the story, of its overt political overtones. Just 2 weeks before its premiere in 1805, the production, which seemed to have been all cleared, ran afoul of the Viennese censors and was shut down. Again, the deft machinations of the librettist got the opera approved by the Council of State. So he rather cleverly invoked the ghost of Maria Theresa was invoked, and they emphasized the conjugal aspect of this play. It was about upholding marriage and the virtues of this faithful woman who rescued her husband. And even to sweeten the pot, they decided that they would be able to premiere the opera on Maria Theresa's Saint's Day. So the minister of police required officials to be present with the libretto in hand to assure that the performance didn't deviate from the approved version. Unfortunately, this is some bad luck. By opening night, Napoleon had occupied Vienna. The aristocracy had fled to their rural estates. The audience was largely composed of French soldiers and a few local critics, none of whom were impressed. Beethoven did create a second version in 1806 with no greater success. However, one thing that happened at this time I don't think we always think of in the whole music world, symphonies, operas, much of this music was not consumed the way that we are able to consume it. It was for a very limited audience. Public performances, especially of symphonic works, were quite rare. But the way people knew most of these works was through piano arrangements. That there was a thriving business for that. So it would have been the same with Fidelio. The opera would have been quite widely known through these published piano versions at home. The third version came out in 1814, the same year as the start of the Congress of Vienna, which uttered in Metternich's police state. The opera was rebranded as a moral of wifely fidelity and courage. The princely ruler who comes to rescue the prisoner and punish the corrupt governor can now be viewed as a benevolent ruler. The reach of Metternich's secret police and its effect on Beethoven was monumental. We already talked about that 1 in 5 citizens. I don't know how many people are here, but, maybe, that's a staggering thing to consider. We're working as a spy for the government. This, along with Beethoven's advanced deafness, seriously limited the active social discourse of Beethoven and his social network of writers, journalists, and intellectuals. We know that's interesting. I don't know if you know that in Beethoven's late life, his hearing was so bad that he started to use conversation books. So people would write to him, and then he would respond verbally. So it's actually an amazing trove of information about Beethoven. We only get one side of it. We don't always know what Beethoven said. But interestingly enough, when Beethoven he was known to rail against the things that he did not like. But there's a quote from one of these private conversation things where one of his conversational partners wrote, "Some other time. Hansel the spy is here right now." So we even know that Schubert, who was part of a group of painters, writers, poets, all desperately poor, they gathered together in little gatherings called Schubertiaden. And during one of those, the police burst in, and one of Schubert's friends was taken away and imprisoned for something he said. The Congress of Vienna defined a new enemy of the state. Before the French Revolution, the enemy were the lower classes trying to upend the order of things. After the Revolution and the Congress of Vienna, the enemy is now nationalism. And so there comes a new object for music censors to shut down. And it's here where we meet our heroic resistors. Chopin, the understated champion of Polish independence, and Verdi, the activist champion of the emerging nation of Italy. So, I played for you at the beginning this little mazurka by Chopin. This is a Polish folk dance. And Chopin who was born in Poland into a French family, but his father was a teacher. And his teachers, his students were, of course, aristocratic families. And Chopin would spend summers in their estates in the country where he was exposed to this authentic Polish folk music, which left a lasting impression on him, for sure. Chopin's first foray into an international performing career coincided with the Warsaw Uprising in 1830. So Chopin would have been about 20 years old when he decided to leave and start an international performing career. And this coincided with the Warsaw Uprising, which was a failed uprising and was brutally put down by the Russians. And Chopin spent the rest of his life, as an expatriate, along with the exiled Polish nobility who made Paris their waiting place. Chopin was a great Polish patriot. However, he was not an agitator. His resistance was subtly expressed in the national folk rhythms of the mazurka and the polonaise. We might identify Chopin's mazurka performances as a kind of nationalistic code to the Polish diaspora, who were always under police surveillance. During one Dresden recital, Chopin's mazurka performance motivated the police to have him leave the city. And to understand the nationalistic power of his mazurkas, we only have to remember that during the rule of the Third Reich, all performances of Chopin's mazurkas were banned in Poland. So this, I don't know, you already heard a mazurka, so I don't really have to play another one. But there are some of his most engaging music. And you can imagine how this connected with the Polish exile community. Verdi was born in 1813, and at that time much of Italy was ruled as part of the Austrian Empire or part of Napoleon's orbit. Verdi was an unabashed and outspoken nationalist and supporter of the Risorgimento, or unification of Italy. Italy was not at this time, of course, a country. Many of the operas had to be rewritten in order to gain censors' approval. Any rebellious actions or characters or morally questionable characters were forbidden. So commonly the character and settings would have to be changed. So this is the sort of adaptive technique. One of Verdi's opera, Ballo in Maschera, originally was set in Sweden, and the king Gustav III was assassinated in the opera. And this would not be approved by the censors. So Verdi changed the location from Sweden to Boston. And I know, it is kind of, even to this day, kind of silly. And the king just became a governor. So that was able to clear the cens. Rigoletto, another Verdi opera, the main character was a king. He's rather morally dissolute. And so to approve the censors, he had to be downgraded to a duke, and the setting had to be moved from Venice to Mantua. And then it was fine. Verdi was, however, able to include many coded calls to resistance and support for the independence and unification of Italy. Many of his works leading up to the revolutions of 1848 contained coded messages of resistance. These were especially present in the opera, in the courses, which were considered the voices of the people. The most notable and enduring expression of national aspiration and patriotism was the course of Jewish refugees from Nabucco. And that's the second excerpt that we're going to play. So this may be familiar to you. It continues to be the sort of almost an unofficial anthem of Italy. But this, Verdi was able to use the voice of the Hebrew refugees who were in Nebuchadnezzar's country to express their desire, the nation's desire for freedom from their oppressors. Have you heard that tune before? Yeah, it's been used. It was used at the Olympics and things like that. Sorry that it's so short, but it's in the context of the opera. It's such an inspiring and uplifting moment. And this was the moment at which the citizens of what was not yet Italy were able to express their hope for freedom. Verdi himself became an icon for Italian national unification and freedom. So there was his name, Verdi, was sort of the underground code for Vittoria Emanuele Re d'Italia. So this was, Emmanuel became the first king of a unified Italy. Verdi lived a long life. So even though the revolutions of 1814, 1848 were put down, Verdi lived to see the unification of Italy. In the early 20th century, two tyrannical states exercised tight censorship in music. These are probably quite familiar to us. Now, any expression that resists German or Soviet nationalism is excised or forbidden. So the censors have, changed their perspective. Now everything has to promote the country and the regime in power. Of course, during the Third Reich, music by any Jewish composer, Mendelssohn, Mahler, any form of decadence, including American jazz, was strictly forbidden. Some Soviet composers, like Kabalevsky, were totally compliant with Stalin's requirements for art. In Russia, there was a whole amazing structure of censorship, and sometimes it's hard to know where the line between political idealism and personal revenge, they sometimes overlap. That may sound familiar to us here. So. Prokofiev, and especially Shostakovich, walked a thin and dangerous line and often ran afoul of Soviet censors. Some Soviet composers, some Russian composers decided to leave and become a part of, many of them came to America. Prokofiev left Russia, went to France, but he could not live there. He went back to Russia. He was, I think, when I think of him, I think he seems a bit naive, thinking that everything would be okay. And we know both he and Shostakovich, of course, managed to survive. Shostakovich was more daring and ran afoul of the censors more often than Prokofiev. However, Prokofiev's first wife was taken to Siberia and just disappeared. So we're up to kind of our own time now. And, as we think of, I think now, at least up till now, we have so much freedom that we live under, that some of this idea that we can't, especially in the world of this rarefied world of classical art, there are any limitations on expression seemed sort of absurd to us, but things are changing. And I think sort of also in the postmodern world, if there are kind of calls for censorship, they tend to come from below rather than down from above. So there could be what we might say a certain marginalized group or something that puts pressure on a certain art to conform to a set of ideals like that. So, here we are, sort of knowing what happens next for us. So we're living in a world that's, even I was thinking, Brenda and I just saw this a few months ago. So many things have changed just in a few months. And we may think, in the world of the classical arts, we're free from any kind of interference. But I think, too, that may be a bit naive. We have to remain vigilant, for sure. But if you ever have despair, put Beethoven's music on. Because he's a very uplifting champion for the dignity of all human beings. So I want to say, I don't know what we are on time. I guess there's a clock. I'm not used to looking at clocks. But if anybody has a question, we may be able to, I'm happy to. I know the answer. If I don't know it, I'll just make it up. Since you're not going to turn me in, right? Yes.
Well, I was wondering, when you said you first came and were playing
Yeah.
back in the day, what year was that, you think?
Let me think. It probably was 1978 or something like that. Yeah, so you have to go back, pull out your old disco clothes, bell bottoms, to think about that. And some of you, we're not yet here. Yes, sir.
You talked a lot about censorship coming from mostly from above.
Mm-hmm.
Did any composer ever self-censor to cleverly obfuscate the censors to preserve their art?
Right. I can't give you a specific example, but I think that's a likely, outcome. And we're I just touched on the big names. There was a thriving, there were so many composers that we couldn't touch on. But I think that's very true. It's very likely. And self-censorship is equally chilling, really, I think, when you think about it. Okay? All right.
I'm happy to see you.
You want
Right.
to play another mazurka while we go out the door?
I could. I mean, sometimes this one, that is pretty rousing just from the start. Not all mazurkas are in this style, but some are rather nostalgic and longing for something. He's an expatriate, so he has love for this, and we can hear that in the music. But almost always there's something inserted that brings up the blood. Yeah. This is another mazurka.